If you were born between 1981 and 1996, you are considered a millennial, and you are about to be moving through what are known as the midlife transits. It's hard to believe, but some of us are already going through it right at this very moment, and others of us are going to be going through it over the next decade or so. Now, there are four key midlife transits to talk about: the Uranus opposition, the Neptune square, the Pluto square, and the Chiron return. In this series of videos, I'm going to be focusing on what the midlife transits are going to look like for millennials as we prepare to move through these life-changing pivotal moments, what we can expect specifically with our placements, and how to move through them in a constructive rather than destructive way. This video is all about the Uranus opposition specifically for millennials. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back. I am Dana Solara. I'm an astrologer and spiritual coach, and I'm very excited to talk to you today about what's on deck for millennials as we move through the so-called midlife transits. Now, if you are not a millennial, you're still going to get a lot out of this video because you'll be able to use this almost as a reflective astrology moment if it's something you've already experienced, and if you have not experienced it yet, you can still get a taste for what this transit is going to be like. However, I am also talking more broadly about these transits, about the Uranus opposition, the Neptune square, and the Pluto square over on Nightlight Astrology. I'm going to link those videos down below because they're going to be published right around the same time as these are. I'll also put all of the videos, the Nightlight videos and my videos on my channel in a playlist so they're easy for you to find and navigate. If you don't already subscribe to the channel, why don't you do that? Why don't you go ahead and subscribe? We do month ahead videos, we do horoscopes, we do really whatever y'all want. But today we're talking about midlife transit, specifically the Uranus cycle and the Uranus opposition for my fellow millennials. Now, the astrology of the moment is something a lot of us tend to consume rather mindlessly and in a way that actually doesn't help us and just kind of adds more noise. I like to present the astrology of the moment as a way to tune in and go deeper and be intentional with how we move through life. And I think thinking about the major moments of our life from an astrological lens is an incredibly powerful way to do this, not just after the fact as a reflective astrology tool, which I love to do and I think is a highly underrated way of using astrology, but also for what has not yet come to pass. We can look at the major transits, the major cycles that we will be going through, that all human people go through, provided they live long enough to experience them, and choose how we want to move through it with intention, with our eyes open, so to speak, rather than just clutching and praying and hoping for the best, right? So what do we mean when we say midlife transits? Well, the transiting planets, the planets as they're in the sky right now, are always interacting with your birth chart. And the relationship between a natal planet and its transiting counterpart shows us the cycles of a life. Now, you are likely familiar with lunar cycles and how they work, that there's a new moon, an opening square, a full moon, which is actually an opposition between the sun and the moon, and the closing square, and then the cycle repeats all over again. We can apply that same symbolism and that same concept to what's going on with a transiting planet and its natal counterpart. So, for example, when transiting Uranus squares our natal Uranus, this is an opening square between natal and transiting Uranus. And by the time we're in our late 30s or 40s, Uranus will reach an opposition to our natal Uranus. Okay, and we can think of that as a culminating moment with respect to Uranian theme. So just as the planets have cycles, we have cycles, and the planets help us understand what time it is, so to speak, in the cycle of our own unfolding and growth. The midlife transits are the moments that the outer planet cycles come to some kind of head. With Uranus, it's an opposition. With Neptune and Pluto, it's a square. With Chiron, it's a return. Again, we'll get into all of those in their own respective videos, but it's, I think, fascinating that these all happen around the same decade, and they really facilitate for me, from a super large point of view, a rebirth into the second phase of life. But let's talk about the Uranus cycle specifically. It takes Uranus about 84 years to go around the zodiac in full, and it spends about 7 years in each zodiac sign. The square is going to happen in your early 20s, the opposition around 38 to 45, and the closing square happens in your 60s. And if we're lucky enough, we live to 84 and we see a Uranus return. But this video is about the opposition. So what is the opposition like? Well, if we know the opposition is like a full moon, we know that it's a culmination, it's a peak, and it's a peak in Uranian theme. So what is Uranus about? It's about liberation. It's about breakthrough. It's about revolution and innovation. So this is a time in life where we experience a sudden, unexpected liberation, unexpected freedom, a major plot twist that we would have never seen coming. It can come from within, where you sort of blow up your life, or it can come from without. There can be circumstances in which you suddenly find yourself in totally new territory. I will remind you that the card associated with Uranus in tarot is the Tower. And I mentioned this in my Nightlight astrology video about this topic, but the Tower looks terrifying. Let's be real. Let's call it what it is. And I don't want anyone to ever be afraid of astrology, especially if you're my target audience for this video. If you are a millennial and this has not happened for you yet, I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to understand that what is no longer working in your life is going to fall apart at this time, okay? That liberation is ultimately helpful, but it can be a little confronting because it requires change. That's the real fear that we see when we look at the Tower. It's the fear of the unknown. I think ultimately a Uranus opposition is here to free us, but in doing that, it's going to make us pretty uncomfortable. We're going to be put in new territory that we haven't been in before. So it does require a willingness and an openness to new things and new experiences. The extent to which you've been authentic up to this point in your life is the extent to which this transit can be constructive. If you have spent your life resisting or denying what's true for you, what you truly want, then the Uranus opposition, I think, could be experienced as quite destructive. It is ultimately trying to help you arrive at a more truthful expression for your life. But if you've resisted that, you can see why the experience of the opposition might feel quite challenging. And so the way that this feels for you is going to depend entirely on the extent to which you've been true to yourself and the extent to which you can be true to yourself in this moment. And the great news is you can always choose differently. If up to the point of the Uranus opposition, you've been really resisting or denying what feels true and right for you, you can change your mind. You can decide, like, I'm not going to run away from myself any longer. I'm going to run toward who I want to become. That's the invitation with the Uranus opposition, and you can always choose to take that invitation, okay? Today, we're going to get into kind of the generational experience. So what I say today is going to be true for you in the sense that as millennials, we were all born with Uranus either in Sagittarius or Capricorn. More on that in a second. So I'm going to speak today to the historical things that were happening when we were born, as well as what I think might come up based on the zodiacal axis that will be activated when Uranus opposes our natal Uranus. But it's going to be broad by nature because we obviously would need to look at your natal chart to get more specifics for you personally. We also would want to think about the timing more precisely for you because your Uranus opposition will be most acutely felt when you have a degree-based opposition rather than a whole sign-based opposition. So let's go ahead and talk more about what this looks like for millennials. The millennial generation spans between 1981 and 1996. we've got a couple of edge cases here. So the earliest millennials technically, which I think could actually be grouped to late Gen X, most of 1981, will have Uranus in Scorpio. And so I'm not going to cover that today. If you are Gen X or you were born in 1981 and you want me to go back and talk about it, I will. Leave me a comment and let me know. But if that's you, the opposition has already happened. It's already complete. You've been through this portal already. And you could still watch this video to get a good idea of a reflective astrology kind of prompt that you could look at your chart with. The other edge case here is those born at the end of the window, so in 1996. These are the latest millennials, and really I would say the earliest Gen Z. You will have Uranus in Aquarius. Your opposition is going to happen when Uranus enters Leo. That's not till 2039 and beyond. So we are focused specifically on the majority of millennials who have Uranus in Sag or Uranus in Capricorn. So you have Uranus in Sagittarius if you were born between roughly 1981 and 1988. Your opposition is going to happen while Uranus is in Gemini, which is 2025, 2026 to 2033, and this is happening now. If you were born between the back half of 1988 and 1995, you have Uranus in Capricorn. Your opposition will happen when Uranus is in Cancer, which is going to be roughly 2032/2033 through 2039. And so it's not happening immediately, but it is coming up, and we are building toward it as we speak. So there are two different Uranus cohorts within the millennial generation, and these are going to be two completely different midlife questions. One is going to be about what you believe, and the other is going to be about where you belong. So let's get into the Uranus and Sagittarius cohort. Let's talk about what was going on in the world when Uranus was in Sagittarius during our birth. Sagittarius is a mutable fire sign ruled by Jupiter, which is all about belief, spirituality. It's about philosophy, exploration, and as the mutable fire sign, it is the last zodiac sign before Capricorn, where in the northern hemisphere we have the winter solstice, where light starts waxing once again. In other words, the days start getting longer from the shortest day of the year. So Sagittarius is the sign just before that. So there's a way in which Sagittarius energy is very much like fuck the rules, eat, drink, and be merry. Let's just have a good time. They're not really thinking about tomorrow in a sense, because it's all about what feels good right now. There is a lot of passion with Sagittarius. There's a lot of hope because that's what Jupiter is about. And there's a strong ability to adapt and be flexible and change. And in fact, there's a desire for that. And we know that Uranus disrupts and electrifies whatever sign it's in. So what do we see happening during this time in history? One interesting facet for me, the boom of televangelism. Very Uranus in Sagittarius, because it's about a broadcasting of spiritual beliefs and these very, I think, Uranian characters, people like, what's her name, Tammy Faye, and the 7-Eleven Club. And in any case, I think that it's a good manifestation. Good is not the right word, but it's an accurate manifestation, let's say, of Uranus in Sagittarius. We've got this spiritual figure, this larger-than-life performer, Tammy Faye Messner, with her mug just beat for the gods, right? Literally beat for God. And so you see cable and satellite TV exploding with these kinds of characters. We also have things like the Challenger disaster in Chernobyl in 1986. So this sends major shockwaves to the grand projects of exploration and progress at this time. We see things literally exploding that were supposed to be sort of exploring new frontiers, not sort of, like actually exploring new frontiers, right? And then there's this Reagan era optimism in the 80s. When I think about the 80s, I think about the Gen Alpha, or like current generation, the current young people term of maxing. I'm very uncool, okay? I'm not in touch with youth culture, except to the extent that I teach high school. I have a bit of a pulse on it from that angle, but this whole idea of maxing, it feels very Sagittarian. And when I think about the Reagan era optimism and this patriotic worldview, that there's sort of a return to values at this time. I think of Reagan himself being kind of a Uranus and Jupiter figure, in that he was, an actor. He wasn't really a politician prior to this. And then I think about things like Reaganomics and the deregulation and kind of hands off. That feels very Uranus and Sagittarius to me as well. We're kind of backing off, hands off, fuck the rules, which financially, yes, but in other ways, not at all, because we have this moral order that comes back up around this time. And it's interesting because you wouldn't think a return or a resurgence of conservatism would feel very Uranian. But if we're thinking about Jupiter being the ruler here, I don't know. I kind of see it because Jupiter is a lot about values. If nothing else, I think about how Reagan really sold the dream of America being the city upon a hill, which I think he used literally in a speech. And if you aren't familiar, was the same phrasing and language that a Puritan minister, if I'm not mistaken, it's either John Winthrop or William Bradford, one of the two. I'll figure it out once I go back to teaching American Lit in August. One of those two used that phrasing to talk about America and what America should be from the Puritan view, which was a beacon of God's chosen people creating God's promised land, which we could say a whole lot about that, right? But there's a way in which that religious mindset comes back into what is America, what should America be. There's really a resurgence of our Puritan roots at this time. So I think it's just fascinating that while Uranus was in Sagittarius, there was both the exploration aspect kind of showing up with Uranus, as well as the focus on spirituality and values that we would expect with a Sagittarian transit. I think for those of us who are growing up at this time, this narrative of you can be anything, dream big, very Jupiterian, and really seeded the way that we saw the world. We all know, like developmentally, what you're surrounded with and by, like the environment you're in as a child, creates your worldview. And the worldview that those with Uranus and Sagittarius were being born into had a little bit to do with this you can be anything concept. And so all of this shapes Uranus and Sagittarius natives to be raised inside these big narratives that the American dream and meritocracy, the gospel of college, oh my God, I have so much to say about that. Organized religion as the default, traditional values as being very important. You were taught to seek meaning, to explore, to dream big, and to find the truth and follow it. So before we get into the opposition for you Uranus and Sag natives, we should talk about the square. And for you guys, the square is happening in Pisces, and it's roughly between 2003 to 2011, depending on when you were born. So what happened between 2003 to 2011? If you can recall, we had a massive crash in America and really worldwide, 2008, this economic crash. And this was where the cracks in the meritocracy narrative kind of started to show. If you're not familiar with the term meritocracy, it's this very American concept that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that your merit is what should get you where you are, and that in America, you can be as successful as you're willing to work hard for it, that you should get what you deserve, essentially. Now, when this crash happened in 2008, a lot of people lost everything. A lot of people who had worked really hard lost everything and suddenly found themselves having to start from scratch. And for Uranus and Sag natives, you were in your early 20s here. So what was happening for you? Did you suddenly realize the path you had set out for was not going to work anymore? I think of Uranus transits a lot like a trapdoor. Like you're walking on a path and all of a sudden, bloop, now you're in a totally different landscape. Maybe you had graduated from college, you've got a degree, and now boop, all of a sudden your career path is obsolete, or there are absolutely no jobs because this crash just happened. So what was going on for you during the square? That's the first piece of the puzzle that we want to think about, because it's going to give us a sense of what is coming up as we move forward. It's fascinating to me that Uranus and Sag natives, your Uranus square happened both in Jupiter ruled signs. Okay, that's not always going to be the case, that the ruler of your natal Uranus is going to be the same ruler as the transiting Uranus when you're experiencing the square. So it really reinforces that this is about your vision, this is about your values, this is about your beliefs. This is where you might have had some kind of existential crisis, like, oh my God, what do I believe? What do I want? Where am I going? What do I envision for my life? So it's worth sitting with, what did this show up like for you, roughly 2003 to 2011, okay? And now this takes us to the Uranus opposition. So what do I see for Uranus Sag natives with this opposition? Well, first of all, you're already in it, right? Especially if you were born at the early phase of Uranus and Sagittarius. Remember, this is like a full moon for Uranus. So it's a culmination, it's a peak moment where you are presented with an opportunity to reflect on the extent to which you've been authentic to yourself. We are in the Sagittarius Gemini axis here. So let's sit with what this is about. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. And in traditional astrology, Mercury and Jupiter, their signs always oppose each other. And as archetypes, they are opposite as well. Jupiter is the big picture. It coheres, it's faith, it's hope, it's optimism. It brings things together. Mercury is critical. It disseminates, it analyzes, it critiques, it doubts, it questions. So whereas Jupiter is like the hopeful preacher, Mercury is the critical scientist. So they're diametrically opposed in this way, and we can see that reflected in the fact that Jupiter rules Sag and Mercury rules Gemini. So what does that mean for the opposition? That we are being asked as Uranus and Sag natives in our Uranus opposition to question the things that we have not questioned yet. That the freedom is an offer to choose what you believe deliberately, maybe for the first time in your life, but it might arrive as a crisis of faith, okay? Think about the moment we're in right now. AI generated everything, fractured media, no consensus reality, no shared truth. So the Sag natives question was, what is true? And this opposition with Uranus and Gemini asks, what are your beliefs? Are they just things you've inherited, or are they things you've chosen on purpose? And there's going to be some kind of pressure test, I think, where if the beliefs you've held on to are not truly your own or don't make sense for your life anymore, that is going to become apparent. Okay, what is the truth? What is worth putting a stake in the ground for? What values are you willing to keep, and what values no longer align for you anymore? What survives when certainty gets a counter argument from every angle? I think about something like a person who's had the same faith or political identity or worldview for years and suddenly is presented with something that forces them to question it. Like they're scrolling at 2 a.m., they see something and they suddenly realize, I don't know what I think about anything anymore. So there is a way in which confusion, I think, is going to be the theme for this opposition. But confusion can be divine, right? It can be a path to liberation but it may not feel great in the moment. And that's where we get the Tower card all over again, right? The feeling of being flung from the tower of certainty is not great. Like, we don't love it, it's not fun, but you find yourself on more solid ground after the fact. So the invitation is to follow the questions. Now, finding some grounding within that is also going to be very, very important, because it is easy to get lost in the sauce. I unfortunately could see something like AI psychosis becoming a much bigger deal during this time, because if we're in this space of questioning and being unsure and not knowing, and we desperately want that certainty, and we're not able to sit with the doubt and explore it, then we might go to something like a chat tool and try to find that sense of grounding where it's not really there, and get totally thrown off, right? So if you can go into this transit, or even if it's happening already for you right now, if you have Uranus at the early degrees of Sag, what can you do to find grounding? What can you do to explore this divine discontent, this divine confusion in a way that feels safe and grounded, and not like everything is falling apart and what the fuck is true anymore? If we think about Uranus and Gemini historically, it has rewired communication and fractured consensus. I think about the genesis of computing technology in the 1940s and World War II. You have the telegraph in the 1860s. We have, of course, the Civil War. We have the Revolutionary War. Uranus and Gemini can bring awakening. And the personal awakening happening for Uranus and Sagittarius natives is happening inside a collective awakening for Uranus and Gemini. So let's go back to constructive versus destructive ways. We've talked about the shadow manifestation of this, that if we can't find a way to feel some sort of grounding in the doubt that we're going to be navigating through, the divine confusion that will likely ensue with Uranus and Gemini, where we're questioning everything, we need to be able to find some kind of grounding, okay? And frankly, I think this transit always feels a little destructive, because that's the nature of liberation. We talk about freedom and liberation without really thinking about the fact that it's not a comfortable experience, because it sounds like what we want. And of course, we do want freedom and liberation, but it also requires destroying what's bound us. And in this case, what's bound us has likely been the values and the beliefs that we've never questioned. And that act of questioning can feel quite confronting. So where can you find some solid ground at this time? You want to consciously choose your convictions. You want to work in alignment with what is true for you. And you want to be unafraid to break from tradition, okay? It's necessary to embrace Uranus and Gemini because it's happening. Like, you can't do anything but embrace it except resist it. And resisting is where the destructive manifestations are going to come up. So embrace the questioning while also finding something that feels like solid ground for you. And to me, that's simply a spiritual practice, a daily practice of self-connection where you are connecting to what is true for you. You may not be able to easily discern what is true out there, but you can always connect with what is true for you in here, okay? So Uranus in Sag natives, this is a time of clarifying what is true for you. It may feel cloudy and confusing at times, but on the other side of it, you are going to feel much more attuned to your values, your beliefs, and your vision. So embrace it. So this takes us to Uranus and Capricorn. If you were born between 1988 and 1995, roughly, you have Uranus in Capricorn. So this is a very different vibe from Uranus and Sag, because previously we were talking about the Jupiter-Mercury axis. Here we're talking about a Capricorn-ruled Uranus, which will be opposed by a moon-ruled Uranus. All right, so let's start with the historical detail first. Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. Saturn is all about structure, exile, that which is weird and sort of peripheral or outsider energy. It's death, it's limitation, it's endings, it's restriction, it's rules. Capricorn is very much about institutions, governments, corporations, hierarchies, tradition. So with Uranus in Capricorn, we have the sudden collapse or restructuring of those things. And in some cases, we also saw the strengthening of those things because Saturn was also in Capricorn. So what happens? In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. The Soviet Union dissolves in 1991. So the entire world order of the previous half century is restructuring in a handful of years. We're literally redrawing the map around this time. We also have President Bush speaking about something called the New World Order around this time. So it's fascinating that there's discussion of this restructuring of the hierarchy and the boundaries and who's in charge and what the rules are. We have other things like corporate downsizing and restructuring waves, the early 90s recession, and then the World Wide Web going public from 1991 to 1993. You can see the infrastructure of work and information being rebuilt. So how did it shape us, Uranus and Capricorn natives? I really think Uranus and Capricorn natives, being one myself, are inherently rule breakers. We inherently question and critique the rules. And wherever Capricorn is in your chart, you can see that show up for you. Like I have Uranus in the 4th, and I have definitely questioned the structures in my home and family structure and kind of the family culture. I have been vocal about questioning the rules, so to speak, within my family. And we were also, broadly speaking, born as the stable structure promise was visibly breaking. We were raised on institutional distrust, and then we were coming of age as the 2008 crisis was unfolding. In the aftermath of that, we are the generation of gig work and living in a housing market that has priced us out. So in other words, the structure that we grew up as being basically gospel, we've seen it fail over and over and over again. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this, especially as we get into the Pluto square, because I have a lot of hope that millennials are going to radically change the way the world works. But let's look first at the Uranus square and what that was like for us. So for us, with Uranus and Capricorn, the Uranus square happened in Aries. So this is a Saturn-ruled Uranus and a Mars-ruled Aries. This is happening roughly between 2010 and 2019. So this is where I think we see something really interesting, the individual rebellion phase, where the seed of questioning the structures that we were born into really shows up and we say, fuck this, I am doing something totally different. I will tell you briefly how this showed up for me. I happen to have Uranus, as I said, in the 4th house. So Uranus was in my 7th house when I experienced the square, and I decided to leave the job that I got straight out of college, which was a teaching job, and move to San Diego with my boyfriend, who became my fiance. Pretty interesting how literal this is, that through my partnership, I broke from tradition. I left home, hello Uranus in the 4th house, and moved 2,000 miles across the country to do something completely different than what I went to college for. And I really didn't have a plan. I just knew I'm going and I'm going to figure it out when I get there. So how did that show up for you? And I'm bringing identity into this, not just because we're talking about Uranus, but because we're in Aries, the sign of new frontiers and of individuality. The tarot card associated with Aries is the Fool. It's very much about going out on your own and doing your own thing. So what were you doing during your Uranus square? What was it about for you? Think about that as we now start to talk about what the opposition might hold in store for us. This is going to be when Uranus is in Cancer, okay? So what is Cancer all about? It's ruled by the moon. It's about safety, security. It's about tradition. It's about legacy. It's about memory. And if we're thinking about this cardinal axis of Capricorn and Cancer, it's a very different quality than what we talked about with the Sag cohort, where confusion was the crisis. For this cardinal axis, I think it's a lot about belonging and foundation. So the questions I think we're going to be wrangling with is, what is home? Where is home? What am I actually committed to building? What feels comforting and nourishing to me, as opposed to what photographs well or what my parents did? This seed that was planted when we were born of bucking the system is coming to a head here. And I think we might see a lot of old traditions get thrown in the trash at this time. I think about someone who perhaps has gone down the path that was laid out for them. You go to college, you get married, you get a corporate job with a 401k, you have the kids, you do the things, right? You follow the plot line, the tradition that was laid out for you. And at this time, they kind of start to see the writing on the wall. But you know what? Like, I never had to do this. I'm spending my whole life 40 hours a week plus, because let's be real, who's working only 40 hours a week these days? It's clearer and clearer every day that the consensus reality, I think, of Capricorn is like the consensus reality a little bit. That the consensus reality that we were given is bullshit. And the idea that you should work your whole life just to have money and some bullshit sense of stability, we can see through that more and more every day. That buying into this lifestyle that we inherited is not satisfying. It's not nourishing. It's not working. And so I think a lot of people are going to be like this person I'm imagining, who is sitting at a desk in a cubicle one day and is just like, you know what? I'm done. Gets up, leaves, and starts a soap business. I think we're going to see a lot of people waking up to the traditions they subscribe to that are no longer making sense in their lives anymore, and trading the structure they were told to want for the life that actually will hold their true selves. And I think about this on a mass scale, like, we're all going to be hitting this opposition together, right? Saturn's going to be here too for a little bit, at least at the beginning of this. And that's fascinating to me because we're going to be, a lot of us, hitting our Saturn opposition around this time as well. So there is a massive peak moment here in terms of things coming to a climax, coming to a head. And I could really see this as a lot of people walking out on the system in whatever way that looks like. I think in a best case scenario, Pluto's still in Aquarius. This is a generational renegotiation of what work, home, and family are for. More of an emphasis on family, more of an emphasis on the kind of life that feels nourishing and sustainable. And I also think about land. Why? Because Saturn can be about land, Capricorn can be about land. Cancer, broadly speaking, is about home and what feels like home. I wonder about mass migrations at this time. I wonder about people having to relocate due to climate change. That's a worst case scenario, and I don't want to fearmonger, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility given where we're at right now, that many people may be physically moving around this time. Neptune is also going to be squaring by whole sign here, so is there a collective restructuring around systems and tech? Possibly, right? In a more positive vein, I think we could see something like co-living, cohabitation, people looking at new ways to live together, more sustainable communities. That would be a really beautiful manifestation of this. Different family configurations, different ways of looking at caregiving. We'll be at this stage of life where a lot of us will be taking care of our parents around this time. So that might be a theme for some of us. A connection to food and land as well feels relevant. I would love to see, personally, maybe new innovations in making our food healthier, right? I'm thinking about microplastics and maybe some innovations around nourishment that help with some of these challenges that we face today in those arenas. So, yeah, I think the instability can be quite literal here, that it might be the actual ground beneath our feet is what's not stable at this time, and we might be moving and relocating. And don't get scared when I say that, right? It doesn't have to be this huge scale thing. It could be very personal to you, and it could be less physical and more psychological, that what has felt comforting and nourishing and like home to you no longer does, and you find yourself suddenly having to relocate what feels like home for you. It's like you're standing in the kitchen of an apartment that you pay too much for, that you feel proud of only because it feels like what you've been striving for all this time, but you suddenly realize that it was never actually what you wanted. It doesn't feel like home to you, and you're ready to change it, right? It can be as personal and internal as something like this. So to recap, I think the Uranus and Sag generation is renegotiating belief, and the Uranus in Cap generation is renegotiating home and belonging. But both are being asked the same thing underneath, which is how much of this life is actually yours. This is ultimately what the Uranus opposition asks you to consider. And the chapter you're in depends on where your natal Uranus is. If you have Uranus in Sagittarius, you are already living through it, honey. Like, you are moving through it, okay? It's happening, so embrace it. And if you were born with Uranus in Capricorn, it's coming. And it's worth sitting with now so that you can start to notice the ways in which it's starting to show up already, because it could already be showing up in some way for you. In the next video, we are going to look at the Neptune square, which is going to land within a year or two of the Uranus opposition for almost everyone. And that is not coincidental. That is how the math checks out. And it creates this situation where the midlife transits can all kind of feed each other. So this is just one part, one piece of the puzzle. And we're going to get deeper into it as we continue on with this series. I have some free resources down for you below if you'd like to go deeper with astrology. I'm excited to share those with you. If this video helped you, leave a comment with your questions, subscribe to the channel if you don't already. And I hope this was really helpful for you, okay? I love you. I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you're at, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.